everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be really digging into something that trips up a ton of new coders. And it might not be what you expect. Like, we're not talking about picking the perfect first language or which framework is the hottest right now. We're diving into the, I guess you could call it the new coder trap. And to help us navigate this whole thing, we've got a fantastic expert with us today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So before we bring our expert into the conversation fully, let me just lay out what this trap actually is, right? It's like, you know how when you're first starting out with anything, you get kind of fixated on the tools, on the shiny new things, instead of like the fundamentals?
Yeah, totally.
It's so easy to get caught up in that. And that's what we're going to unpack today, how to make sure you avoid that trap, and more importantly, how to set yourself up for success. You know, really accelerate your coding journey.
Yeah, absolutely crucial.
Now, this article we're diving into today, it talks about how when you're just starting out coding, it's so easy to get really into the building part, you know?
Right.
Like you're learning syntax, messing around with React, JavaScript, maybe even building one of those classic to-do list apps that are in every tutorial. And hey, those are great first steps. But this article, it argues that there's a bit of a danger there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's like we get so focused on the what we're building that we forget about the how and the why behind it all.
I see. Yeah.
So turning to our expert here, I'm curious, have you seen this in your own work? What is it about this approach that's so tempting for new coders, and where does it usually lead them, astray?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've seen. There's just this undeniable thrill, this rush you get from actually building something, anything, with code, even if it's something small or simple. And I think that excitement, it often pulls new coders towards, the more tangible aspects. They focus on the syntax, the immediate satisfaction of getting an app to work. But the article, it brings up a really important point. At the end of the day, those are just tools.
Okay.
It's like, imagine a race car driver who's totally obsessed with how cool their car looks, but they have absolutely no idea about the rules of the track, how to actually race. They're all style, no substance.
They be all speed and no strategy.
Exactly. They might make a lot of noise, but they're not going to win any races. And that's where this article really nails it, I think. It argues that the real heart of coding, the skill that underpins everything else is, you guessed it, problem solving.
So it's less about like memorizing every line of code and more about knowing how to use those lines to tackle actual problems.
Exactly. It's about having that structured, methodical way of thinking about challenges. You take a complex task, you break it down into smaller, more manageable steps, and then you use your coding knowledge to create a solution.
Like, it's a recipe, but instead of ending up with a cake, you've got a program that, actually does something cool.
Exactly. And just like with a recipe, you need the right ingredients.
Okay, I'm getting hungry now, but I think I get it. So problem solving is like the foundation of the house, right? You can decorate it with all the fancy frameworks you want later, but if the foundation's shaky, the whole thing is going to fall apart.
That's a perfect analogy. And the beauty of it is, once you've got that solid foundation, learning new languages or frameworks, it actually becomes so much easier.
So it's like you've trained your brain to think like a coder, to see any technical challenge and be like, all right, let's break this down and solve it.
Precisely. And that skill, that way of thinking, it's invaluable.
This is where it gets really interesting to me. The article, it gives these examples of what seem like really simple problem-solving exercises. Things like sorting numbers, finding the biggest number in a set, even just checking if a word is a palindrome.
Right.
But they seem so basic. How did those actually build up those problem-solving muscles we're talking about?
The key is those exercises, they strip away all the complexity of specific syntax or frameworks. It allows you to just focus on the pure logic, So, for example, take sorting algorithms, right? You've got things like bubble sort or insertion sort. And while they're not that complicated to implement, they force you to think, how do I arrange this data in a specific order using code? You're training your brain.
So it's like learning scales on a piano before you can jump into some crazy concerto. Might not be as glamorous, but it gives you that foundation.
You got it. Those exercises, they're all about building that foundational strength, developing those mental muscles that'll serve you no matter what you end up coding. It's about really understanding the why behind the what.
And that brings us to another point the article made that I wanted to dig into a bit. Pseudocode. Can you tell us a bit about what that is and how it fits into all of this?
Of course. Think of pseudocode like a blueprint for your actual code. It's a way to sketch out your solution, but in plain English. almost like you're writing instructions for a friend. And you do it without worrying about the specific rules of a programming language. It's a fantastic way to try out different approaches, to think through the logic without getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty details of syntax just yet.
I love that. It's like sketching out your ideas before committing them to the canvas. Helps you get your thoughts straight, refine things before you dive into the finer details. Okay, this has been awesome. I'm really eager to get into some practical advice, like how can our listeners actually use all of this?
Me too. Let's get practical.
The article outlined 6 really great steps people can take, and I'm excited to go through them with you. But first, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be diving headfirst into those actionable steps you can take to break free from this new coder trap and become a true problem-solving coding master. Stick with us. Okay, so let's get right into those actionable steps. The first one the article talks about, it really hit home for me. Stop, or at least hit pause, on those super simple projects. I'm thinking back to when I was starting out building those to-do list apps. They were fun for a little bit, but I wasn't really pushing myself, you know?
Yeah, it's easy to get stuck in that cycle.
Yeah, totally. So the article's saying to really level up those problem-solving skills, you got to look for things that are a little outside your comfort zone.
Exactly. Think about a program that takes a bunch of data and finds trends, or an app that could help people, like, manage their money or something. Those kinds of projects, they make you think harder about the problem because you're dealing with, like, actual real-world stuff.
Yeah, you're not just checking off a box in a tutorial. You're building something meaningful, something that solves a real problem. And that kind of leads us to the second step, right? Making problem solving itself the priority.
Absolutely. It goes back to what we were talking about before. Those exercises, like sorting algorithms, they might seem kind of basic, but they're like the core of how we think about problems in code.
Right. It's like building those foundational skills.
Exactly. When you understand those concepts, it's not just about like, oh, I can write this code. It's, I understand how to think like a coder.
And then when you get to those bigger, more complex projects, it's less scary because you've got that solid base to build on.
Yeah, for sure. Frameworks and languages, they change all the time.
Yeah.
But knowing how to think critically, how to solve problems, that's what makes you a good coder in the long run.
It's kind of like, what's that saying? Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish.
And you feed him for a lifetime.
There you go. Except, you know, we're teaching people to code, which is way cooler than fishing, in my opinion.
I won't argue with that.
All right, so pseudocode. The article talked about that a lot. It's about planning things out before you even write any actual code. Yeah.
Think of it like a rough draft for your code almost.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, it lets you try out different ideas, make sure your logic works without getting tripped up on the specific way you have to write everything out in code.
Smart. So speaking of thinking things through, the next step in the article was about developing logical and analytical thinking. It's about like training your brain to approach challenges the way a programmer would, right? Any tips on how to actually do that?
Well, it takes time and practice. Like anything else. There's some great platforms out there like Algo Academy is one. It gives you all these coding puzzles and challenges to work through. And the more you do, the better you get at breaking down problems and coming up with good solutions.
So it's like the more you use those muscles, the stronger they get?
Exactly.
Okay, now, we've been talking a lot about like mastering the fundamentals before jumping into all the frameworks and stuff, but let's be real, those fancy tools are often what gets people excited about coding in the first place.
True.
So how do you balance that? How do you make sure you're building that solid foundation without ignoring all the exciting stuff?
It's a balancing act for sure. The article isn't saying to completely ignore frameworks.
Right.
They're important, especially if you want to like work in web development or app development. It's all about timing.
So making sure you've got that solid base before you start building on top of it.
Yes. Imagine trying to build, like, I don't know, a house on a foundation of sand.
Yeah.
It's not going to hold up well, right?
Not at all.
It's the same with coding. If you jump into a framework like React, say, before you're really comfortable solving problems on your own, you're basically letting the framework think for you.
Which might be okay for a little bit, but eventually it's going to hold you back.
For sure. It's about understanding things deeply enough that you're not just using a framework, you're in control. You're the architect.
You're calling the shots.